Welcome everyone to the second set of shop talks of our second semester, and welcome to our Zoom audience. Last week we welcomed our newly arrived fellows, and this week we will hear from two of them. So thank you to Julia and Ellen for jumping right in. Since we have some new folks with us, I'll just say that I'm Marla Stone, the Mellon Professor of the Humanities here at the Academy. And we also have a whole bunch of new arrivals today so I just want to point out to everyone, and if you're here, you can raise your hand when I say your name. So Manuele Ceruti, who is our Italian Fellow in the Visual Arts, arrived today from Torino. Manuele, no, well, you will get a chance to meet him soon. Our affiliated fellow, Carl Allen Smith, who is Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Arkansas, also arrived today. Carl Allen, well, everyone's jet lagged. Then we have a number of visiting artists and scholars. Eve Dambra, hi Eve, welcome, is Professor of Art History at Vassar College, and she's here with Frank Palaya. Welcome, Frank. Erica Henriks is an adjunct professor of architecture at the Pratt Institute. Erica, okay. See you soon. And then Rosa Loewinger, I see out here, who is a fellow from 2009 and the president and chief conservator of RLA Conservation of Art and Architecture, Inc. And she's here with Todd Kessler. Todd is napping. Well, they came a long way, and so welcome. And then Brian Rose, I believe, is arriving shortly. I don't think he's here yet, but he is professor of Mediterranean archaeology and curator in charge of the Mediterranean section at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, so today we're going to have two talks. Julia will go first, followed by Ellen. No, wrong way around. Okay, all right. I'm pinch hitting today. So there will be various word salads, I'm sure. Okay, so Ellen will go first, followed by Julia. Each of them will speak for 30 minutes. At the 25-minute mark, I will hold up a little 5-minute thing, and then we'll take questions for both of them at the end. So just as you think of your questions, hold them. Okay, so Ellen Pearlstein is presenting today a talk entitled Preserving the Myths and Materials of Indigenous Featherwork. Ellen is the Suzanne Deal Booth Rome Prize in Historic Preservation and Conservation, and she is professor in the UCLA Getty Conservation of Archaeological and Ethnographic Materials and Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Ellen is a conservator, a scholar, and a teacher whose impact on her field has been vast and profound. She's been an innovator in a number of fields, including appropriate stewardship in the preservation of ceremonial or household service of cultural objects, also in the area of sustainable environmental control of collections of tribal museums, self-representation, and cultural preservation, and then finally, also in the areas of conservation, education, and curriculum development. In addition to her position at UCLA, Ellen has been senior conservator at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, as well as having worked for the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, the Museum of America, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Ellen has been awarded a number of awards and fellowships for her work, in addition to the Rome Prize she has right now. In 2009, she was awarded the Sheldon and Carolyn Keck Award from the American Institute for Conservation for distinguished teaching and mentoring in the field of conservation. She was the first recipient of the L.W. Froelich Fellowship in Objects Conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in addition to her conservation work in collections and multiple museum and institutional collaborations, Ellen also has an extensive publications record. Her recent book chapters and articles include, I want to say actually the books first, In 2017, she edited The Conservation of Featherwork from Central and South America, published by Archetype Press, and then a number of book chapters and articles, of which I'll just name a few. Sounds super interesting. Readings in Conservation, Conservation and Stewardship of Indigenous Collections, Changes and Transformations, is currently in press with Getty Conservation Institute. She also published, along with a co-author, a review of fluorescent applications for featherwork in the Molecular Luminescence in Cultural Heritage magazine that's currently under review. She is she's working on a book on South American featherwork entitled Sharing Voices in the Conservation of Featherwork. In 2021, she published with Brian Potter, Identifying Intrusive Non-Indigenous Basketry in Museum Collections, in a journal called Museum Management and Conservatorship. In 2020, she published George Wharton Jones and the Appropriation of Indigenous Basketry in the Journal of American Indian Culture and Research. And finally, this sounded very interesting to me. She published The Bishop's Mitre and Infule, dialogue with the creator of a colonial feathered liturgical vestment that came out in a brand new journal, Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture. Now, Ellen and I were joking that maybe Les should have done the introduction. So if at the end, Les, if I've gotten anything wrong, you can stand up and add to it. Our second talk will be from Julia Sienkewicz. White Power, her talk's entitled White Power in Flesh and Stone, a transnational allegory for the United States Capitol. Incredibly timely. Julia is the Terra Foundation Affiliated Fellow in Modern Italian Studies and Associate Professor in the Fine Arts Department at Roanoke College. Prior to her current position at Roanoke College, she has been Assistant Professor of Art History at Duquesne University and also Assistant Professor of Art History at Auburn University. She has a PhD and MA in Art History, in particular in Art and Architecture of the United States, from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Is it Urbana-Champaign? I've heard it both ways. And a BA in Art History from Mount Holyoke College. She too already is a recipient of a number of fellowships and awards. The National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend in 2020. We'll just editorialize, is really hard to get, having tried several times. And the Franklin Grant from the American Philosophical Society, also in 2020. She has been the Winter Thurr Research Fellow in 2014. She was at the Yale Center for British Art as a research fellow in 2014. And also, they're extremely relevant to her current work, she was a research fellow at the United States Capitol Historical Society in 2011. She has a fascinating list of publications, of which I'll mention a few. She's working on a book based on the project that we'll hear about today, entitled Forms of White Hegemony, Transnational Sculptors, Racialized Identity, and the Torch of Civilization, 1836 to 1865. She's the author of Epic Landscapes, Benjamin Henry Latrobe and the Art of Watercolor, which came out with the University of Delaware Press, Studies in 18th Century Art in 2019. Julia's edited collections include Teaching American Art, which she guest edited for an issue of Art History, Pedagogy, and Practice, which came out in 2021. She has a shortly to be published, Heartrending Mourning, Loss, and Male Sensibility in the Watercolors of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, which will be out in The Social Worth of Tears, Emotional Economy in the 18th Century. And finally, in 2019, she published Art History and Its Publics, Weighing the Pedagogical and Research Benefits of Community Engagement. In socially engaged art history and beyond, alternative approaches to the theory and practice of art history. So incredible amounts of super interesting. With that, join me in welcoming Ellen Pearlstein.
Hi there. I'm gonna- Okay, so I really want to thank Marla for that extraordinary introduction, and thank the Academy for the privileged opportunity to be presented to all of you. I decided of all the different featherwork that I've worked on, and that has informed my my work toward working collaboratively with Indigenous communities, something I'm going to be following here at the Academy in my that I would choose the material from California to share with you. That's in fact what I'm going to start off by just sharing with you images, because I'm presuming there may be a lack of full familiarity with this regalia from Indigenous communities that happen to reside in the state of California. So on each of these images, I'm sharing the source community, the function of the item, the feathers to the extent that they are identified, and the music currently. So this, by the way, it's a top knot on a leather or skin. Oh, is that okay? Okay, better. Thank you. This is a feathered top knot on a skin headdress, a buckskin headdress. I'll just go through these quickly. Homo feathered basket. Again, the types of birds that were sourced for these feathers are named, as is the institution. Pay attention. I'm going to ask you to pay attention to, for example, in my first image, these are red-shafted flicker feathers. This is a full array of different feathers. Here you see the red, the very intense red is the scalp of a pileated woodpecker. So I'm just, pointing these out as you see them. This one is, you're looking at a detail of a jump dance headdress. And again, the intense red are pileated woodpecker. And the pale is deerskin. And this is what that overall headdress looks like. I'll just go through again, quickly click through these for you. This is a dance trailer that would have been worn down the back, and the feathers are a wide array of different feathers. Note the blue ones, the stellar jay. These are owl feathers. I'm just going to point out that they are split along the shaft. If you can just take note of that, that gives them a different kind of weight and movement, and also a curl, a particular curl that is taken on by these are great horned feathers. These again are red-shafted flicker feathers. They've been stripped of most of their barbs on either side of the central shaft. It's the shaft that's being used. The full feather is only available on the top and bottom edges. These are owl feathers. They have not been modified. These are red-tailed hawk feathers, fairly unmodified again. Returning again to red-shafted flickers. These are red-shafted flicker, both tail and wing feathers. And potentially there's some hawk in here too. I want to just bring this to your attention. It's Yokut, and I'll be showing you a map of where these communities are located. This has a particularly exquisite use of plume-wrapped cordage. So this is a vegetable cordage that has been wrapped with the downy or plumulaceous parts of feathers, something that I think is uniquely Native North American as a feather manipulation. This is the border feathers. Again, you can see the stellar jay. It's those blue feathers with the stripes. And there are some so-called iridescent feathers that change the color depending upon the angle of the viewer or the lighting. They shift from blue to green. And this is a Yokut dance watchum or a hand, ornament. Note also that the shaft has been notched, and that you see more of that wrapped, plumulaceous wrapped cordage. So finally, I'm going to finish in this kind of spree of images. I'm just going to end with this one. This is crow feathers, actually unusual in its use. It's Luiseno. It's a top knot, again, worn on the wearer's head. So what I wanted to say is that as a conservator, my starting off point with examining featherwork of this nature was to try to figure out what was the intended appearance for this feathered regalia in California. Unlike pigments, which are selected by an artist, mixed together, used as transparent glazes or opaque layers, undyed feathers are selected. They are influenced by the bird type. They are influenced by the age of the bird, the gender of the bird, the habitat of the bird, the health of the bird. They're influenced by all of those things. They're influenced by the time of year relative to molting when the feather has been harvested, because feathers spend an entire year on the bird. So, and also, why do some communities, such as the Miwok, embrace the use of great horned owl feathers? I showed you, some examples, while the Hoopa absolutely reject owl feathers. And that has to do with, there's a whole array of mythical associations with each of these birds that make communities either gravitate toward their use or absolutely avoid them. So I quickly recognized, again, as a conservator, that feathered regalia have many lives. They have a bird life cycle use, right? They have cultural and performative use when they're used by communities, and they have a museum lifespan. And we tend to see them, I tend to see them 100 years after they've been collected, unless I'm visiting communities. So my contention is that we are simply unable, with just science, our scientific methods, to understand the intentionality behind feathered regalia unless we are able to meet with community members. So these are some of my extraordinary colleagues with whom I've worked. On the left and top center, you see Bradley Marshall, who is a Hoopa regalia maker and ceremonial performer. In the bottom center, you see Frank Lapena, who is a Wintu artist, a regalia maker, and an elder, actually. On the upper right is Susan Billy, who is a Pomo basket weaver and actually is the descendant of a highly revered weaver. She comes from a family of extraordinary weavers. And on the lower right, you see Mio Marufo, who Mio is Eastern Pomo, and she is also very much a practicing environmentalist. There's a very strong connection, as you probably already understand, between these birds and the landscape, right? And the environment and the safety of habitat. I mean, all of these things. It's a very generative area of work. So I made this table. I apologize because the images are so small, but I made this table of 10 of the most culturally important birds in use in California. I had to, in kind of starting some of my more scientifically grounded study, I needed to narrow down the birds and essentially, surveyed which were the most culturally significant. I ended up doing a lot of work on the northern red-shafted flicker that you see, and I already mentioned the pileated woodpecker with its incredibly intense red scalp. the stellar jay for its blue, the mallard duck for its iridescence, the red-tailed hawk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So each of these birds has extraordinary significance for the communities that use them. I also wanted to I don't know, this must have a point. Yes, great. So I'll speak up. I also wanted to just point out to you the location, some of the locations that we're talking about. So I mentioned that Frank Lapena is Winton. He is from this region. I also mentioned the Karuk, the Hoopa, and the Yurok, three very closely affiliated groups that have a lot of shared traditions. I mentioned that Susan Billy is Pomo and that Neil Marufo is Eastern Pomo. I think I also mentioned the Maidu, and I mentioned the Miwok. And then finally, I mentioned all the way down south, the Luiseno with that crow headdress. Los Angeles is somewhere right around here, just to give you a sense. So I got motivated in my own studies and talking to regalia makers about the value of color. I spoke at length to regalia makers about the value of color in their own regalia. This slide is showing you three examples of, 100-year-old flicker feather headbands that are worn on the forehead of regalia makers amongst the Pomo, the Maidu, and the Miwok. And in each case, I flipped the back over or the front over, and I tried to see whether there was better color preservation on the back that was not exposed when the performer was wearing their regalia versus the front, which was exposed when the performer was wearing their regalia. And I think you can see the two on the left are from the Phoebe Hearst Museum at Berkeley. The one on the right is from the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And I think you can see in each instance that the front has slightly less intense color preservation. Of course, it's fascinating. My diagnostic for what the front was that there are these strings that are used to tie the headband onto the wearer's forehead. And you can see in the bottom, this bottom cordage going right along. And also there's decoration like clamshell beads and a quail top knot feathers that you see on the top example. Of course, when I spoke to regalia makers, they said, oh no. If it loses color, we turn it around. Yeah, we adapt it. So, okay, very good to know why we can't work alone. There we are. So I want to share with you a video that, let's see if I can get, I think this will really work because I'm sharing this video with you. I made this video of a Maidu in New York performance north of San Francisco. And I want you to watch the way in which the headband that he's wearing across his forehead, how the two ends of it are pendant. They're extending beyond his forehead and they're moving, right? They have to move. The other thing I want you to note is that this youngster who is following very closely behind, I'm going to tell you, he is not wearing red-shafted flicker feathers because he is too young and doesn't bear the privilege of wearing these feathers. He is wearing orange painted sticks. I've also seen painted goose feathers, dyed goose feather shafts for people who are not privileged to wear the red-shafted flickers. The other point that I wanted to make here is that they are wearing these, they're referred to as feathered capes, but we would see them as skirts. And those are always manipulated to be imitative of the actions of the bird. So the performers are, see? So birds do not let you see the undersides of their plumage for no reason at all. They do it because there's a particular, they are displaying to a potential mate. There are many aspects of bird behavior that are very embedded in these kinds of performances. So you've got the local myth, you've got the local kind of knowledge, the sourcing of the birds, the postures of the birds, all of this factors in to the understanding of this regalia. All right, so I'm going to return to my collaborators again. And I wanted to just tell you like a couple more things about them. So Frank Lapena is, I think I'd mentioned that he is an elder. And in fact, Frank Lapena passed, I think, about 3 years ago, in fact. But Frank Lapena is also a painter of significant renown. And Frank Lapena's paintings are inspired by the regalia. So here too was another indication to me, not just by speaking to regalia makers, but to seeing the way they represent regalia, to understand just how important that coloration is, right? You know, that brilliant kind of red. So he's showing us flicker feather headbands actually, and these wire tufts that are worn for performatively too. Bradley Marshall in the middle is showing me how he stores his own feathers here. So note the plastic bin and bags. And Bradley is a very active participant in Hoopa ceremonial life. And he is he's a culture keeper, he's a traditionalist. He is prepared for the so-called jump dance. He is wearing his pileated woodpecker headdress that I showed you a bit earlier. And I mentioned Susan Billy, and I mentioned already her connection to this great family of Pomo weavers. And this is a book she co-authored called Remember Your Relations, talking about her relative Elsie Allen and the tradition. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that Bradley Marshall maintains a photo archive of thousands of photographs. It was an archive started by his father. It's a private archive, and he is documenting regalia over the decades that are local to the Hoopa, to his Hoopa community. So. Okay, returning now to coloration, again, where I sort of started and circled around. So I'm showing you now another example of a red-shafted flicker feather headband, this time worn by a coyote. It's a coyote figure. Coyote carcasses are part of this kuksu cult dance. So they're part of this kuksu performance. And in this case, this example in the American Museum of Natural History that has been propped up to be upright, but you can see a little bit of the coyote fur, and you can see that this headband is being worn. The lack of coloration in this particular flicker feather headband made me ask an ornithologist about whether there is such a thing as an albino red-shafted flicker, and whether albino red-shafted flickers actually were more highly coveted and more potentially had more impact and importance to this community. I was firmly told, no, there is no such thing. So I'm reminding you what the coloration of this bird is when it's somewhat new, and you can see what this particular regalia looks like. When I showed Frank Lapena images of extremely pale regalia that have been in museums for over 100 years, he told me that if his own regalia reached such a state, that would be the time to sell it to a museum. And then Bradley Marshall His response was that underperformed, non-traditionally cared for regalia is sick and that it needs to be healed. Now, what that consists of, I still do not know, and I may not be privileged to know. But Bradley did take the time to show me at the Phoebe Hearst Museum the way feathers would traditionally be stored amongst the Hoopa, Karuk, and Yurok. And that is, they would be wrapped in a mat made from plant materials that are naturally insecticidal or insect deterrent. And they would be placed into these purpose-built carved wooden containers that have lids. So there was a huge emphasis on avoiding insects and keeping the regalia dark. So I know for a fact that regalia makers such as Frank Lapena and Bradley have kept their regalia for decades and decades. They repair it, they trim it of kind of damaged sections, they replace feathers, they maintain it for quite a long period of time. Again, returning to my initial kind of conservation question, I was like, well, what is the natural variation, color variation that these birds may be available to regalia makers? You know, what is that variation? And I started to look at, you know, what that variation could be. You can see in the upper right most markedly that the red-shafted flicker actually has a co-species that's a yellow-shafted flicker. And there are birds that either through their diet or through kind of breeding can have both yellow and red shafts in their feathers. But I should also point out that the pigmentation, which I'll talk about next, in red-shafted flickers is absolutely diet dependent. It's based on a diet of red berries and red insects. So the bird on the left, which is an acorn woodpecker, very much like the pileated woodpecker, where the color is in the scalp, you can again see some variation in the appearance of the plumage. The same for red-tailed hawk feathers. And I would say the mallard wing feathers look actually fairly remarkably uniform. So my next step in this ongoing research was to look into what are the biological sources for these colorants. And unsurprisingly for the red-tailed hawk, I mean, now it's unsurprising to me, but it's based on melanin. So it's based on the same pigmentation as our hair and our skin color, right? Melanin produces a broad range of coloration, you know, and it does so in bird feathers. The scarlet ibis on the right, which bears the same colorant source as red-shafted flicker, is pigmented from carotenoids. Carotenoids, also sometimes referred to as carotene, is exactly what makes carrots orange. It's something that is part of the, you know, the fruit and vegetable life cycle coloration, and it's ingested by birds that then can have a way to produce this coloration in their plumage. The central example, the mallard duck scalp, is a structural or iridescent color. I can talk about that, like, you know, ad nauseum, but I won't. But it's based on the nanostructure of the feathers. It's the way in which that feather refracts light and reflects it back to us. So it's not based on a pigment in the feather. My research then was to do accelerated light aging, which is, you know, where you sort of really increase doses of lighting to each of these feathers and to see their comparative responsivity, right? Because they're used in tandem, they're used in combination, they're used, you know, we have regalia that's made of, you know, an array of different feathers. So that the sections between the arrows on each of these images were protected from the intense light source. And it's the, thank you. And it's the sections that are outside of those arrows that receive the full dosage of intensity. So what you can see here is the carotenoid pigmented feather on the right, which is in this case a scarlet ibis, but it could have been a red-shafted flicker, loses its coloration more quickly than any of these other colorants. And I also looked at stellar jay, and I looked at all of these other birds too. The melanin pigmented feather, there is some loss. I hope you guys can see that that center section is a bit more saturated and dark. There is some loss, but it's not nearly as intense. And the mallard duck feather lost no coloration at all because it's a structural phenomenon, did not lose pigmentation. I also did studies using ultraviolet radiation. I also did studies using an ultraviolet fluorescent source, i.e. a black light, to look at the feathers. What I noted was when you look at them with ultraviolet fluorescence, you see changes even before you see them in visible light. So what of course we figured out from using ultraviolet radiation on the feathers is that that's such high energy that it not only destroys the color, but it starts to destroy the very fabric of the feather as well. So now we've been experimenting with using ultraviolet fluorescence, i.e. a black light, to examine featherwork that's been in museums for extended periods of time. And this example from the Welt Museum in Vienna is an example of an Amazonian macaw, parrot feather item, and it's been on display. It's from 1800. It's been on display, extensively and fully illuminated with unfiltered light, which is definitely what museums would do the first half of the 20th century, if not, up to 1970 or so. Ultraviolet was not filtered. And you can see my colleague is holding up part of the feathers with a spatula. You can see the color differential and the detail, but you can also see it under ultraviolet in a more pronounced way, perhaps. And so we started to compare other items with known lighting histories, knowing that they had been exposed to ultraviolet radiation, and saw that in fact the two opposing sides of this basket, one shows extensive ultraviolet impact, the other one much less so. They're the same feathers all the way around the full perimeter of the basket. So what are the conclusions? So the conclusions are indigenous feathers cannot really be understood without community collaboration. Communities select undyed feathers for their coloration and mythic associations. Faded feathers, according to them, are a misrepresentation, and it's likely attributable to museum practices, right? Feathers are unequally sensitive to fading caused by light damage, but with ultraviolet radiation, it's even more extreme. And that UV fluorescence or black light diagnostic imaging can assist with estimating past lighting exposure. Quite a useful tool for the conservation community. With that, I would just like to thank a million gazillion people to be acknowledged. So many people helped, and I thank you very much.
Okay, like Ellen, I would like to thank the Academy for giving us this opportunity. Also the Terra Foundation for support of my particular fellowship. Marla for that great introduction, and for the conference on political violence a few weeks ago, to which my paper in part. This is sort of a response. In recent years, public sculpture has come under increasing scrutiny due to concern over the cultural power wielded by such statues and the violence they condone against minoritized populations. In the United States, at least, broad consensus now supports removal of racist sculptures. Tonight, I will not speak to the breadth of these issues, but I wanted to get us thinking with some subtlety about the notion that public sculpture inherently wields cultural power and is itself an agent of violence. What happens instead if we consider the power of the viewer to accept, reject, or reframe the meaning of sculptural form? Or when we acknowledge that most public viewers ignore or misunderstand sculptures, focusing on two federal sculptures removed in the 1950s from the Capitol, I explore cultural reckoning with works long after their destruction. My case study tonight brings us to the ceremonial heart of the United States Capitol, the building's east front, which until 1981 was the site of presidential inaugurations. Carefully choreographed for patriotic pilgrimage, the central doors lead directly into the rotunda, which is connected by an axis mundi to the heavens and to the empty crypt below ground intended for George Washington's remains. Of course, on January 6th, 2021, we witnessed an altogether different form of public assembly here. Like much of the world, I spent that day glued to newscasts, stunned as insurrectionists overran the Capitol. Somewhat uniquely, though, as a researcher studying the specific ideas of race, nation, and power in the building's sculptural program, I was struck by the rioters' complete ignorance toward its art. 30 years ago, art historian Vivian Green-Fried published Art and Empire, the Politics of Ethnicity in the United States Capitol, which pulled back the veil to reveal the racist iconography of the Capitol's artistic program and surveyed its persistent denigration of Indigenous peoples in service of imperial agendas. Yet, as rioters moved through the rotunda, taking selfies and streaming video, they displayed no understanding of how to use the public art, such as Enrico Kausici's Conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians, to support their cause. Fortunately, organized white power groups were also unaware of the Capitol's monumental art could support their social vision. Commentators also failed to make the obvious connections, even as the so-called QAnon shaman performed his white power by playing Indian, a concept theorized by historian Phil Deloria alongside such symbols. The insurrectionists were equally oblivious to the public art opposing their actions, as they poured into every nook and cranny of the East Front. Surely some looked up. If so, they would have seen Luigi Persico's sculptural pediment relief, The Genius of America. This allegory shows America armed with a spear and wearing a liberty cap. Beside her is Hope at right, who anticipates America's bright future. Justice at left unfurls the Constitution and uplifts a balance. Importantly, justice is not blind. She looks for truth, weighing freedoms against despotism. Although the relief's content is typically attributed to John Quincy Adams, an Italian periodical from the 1840s claimed it for Persico and recorded Adams's praise, quote, "You have admirably captured the idea that binds us. It is the thought of our government that every citizen fixing his gaze on the facade of the Capitol should understand in one glance our fundamental, inalterable principles," unquote. Precisely when citizens could have benefited from a sculpture rendering the Constitution's role in preventing despotism, nobody understood what they saw or gave the work more than a passing glance. At least during the insurrection of January 6th, public art was distinctly impotent. With my intimate knowledge of this building and its artistic program, in the last year, I have been thinking a great deal about the intersections of this contemporary crisis and my historical research. I have asked myself what would have happened if these bold rioters had known art history, I know it's silly, and sought to gain maximum benefit from the white power message of the capital's art. And what if the genius of America had actually achieved its intended goal of making citizens think about the Constitution? As a public historian and art historian, even as I think we need to learn more from the impotence of these sculptures, after the insurrection, I also feel a deeper urgency to understand the precise historical ideas about race and power manifest in the artistic program of the Capitol, and in thinking about how the stories, interpretation, and framing of these works could be used more effectively to speak to the pressing issues of our historical moment. Deep historical reading and methodical interpretation requiring slow looking and critical reflection seem an important contrast to mob thinking. Tonight, while fixing our attention on the destroyed Federal Commission at the heart of my book, I hope to give a nuanced history of some of the issues that remain salient in the present, while also inviting us to think more deeply about the present's absence and interpretation of such. The completion of the ceremonial east front of the Capitol and the development of its sculptural decorative program was one of the country's most symbolic nation-building projects. After the Capitol was burned by the British in 1814, its construction was completed in 1829 under the auspices of architect Charles Bulfinch. My book focuses on one commission intended for Bulfinch's east front, though soon surrounded by changes as major additions were begun in the 1850s. The commission and execution of these monumental sculptures, which began in 1836 and concluded in 1852, spanned a vital transitional period for the Capitol and coincided with rancorous years of expansion and increasing disunion. By the time that Luigi Persico's Columbus discovering America at left and Horatio Greenaw's triumph of civilization at right presided over Abraham Lincoln's 1861 inauguration, the architectural context of these sculptures was torn apart, just like the nation around it. At the time of the commission, this project was perceived as the final touch for a facade already adorned with the genius of America, as well as Persico's allegorical war and peace in niches behind the colonnade. The planned location of these final works for the East Front was prominent, allowing direct interaction with the public, perhaps welcoming in the right sort of visitor and deterring others. Inaugural photos and prints, like this one from the 1880s, show the very bodily nature of this interaction as crowds push around and even climb onto these statues during major public events. These images document that many living bodies pressed up against their singular and monumental stone counterparts. But the impact of these sculptures on average members of the public is much harder to glean. Did these viewers think at all about the artistic program across the two sculptures? Did they measure their bodies against the stone, perhaps feeling dwarfed by the sculpted white men, but equal to the smaller stone women? Period texts offer substantial clues to what intellectuals thought of the works, and also what they believed the public should see in them. But in the heat of the moment, as members of the public climbed on or around the sculptures, we do not know what, if any, impact they had. The sculptors themselves, by contrast, understood that these public works would influence their viewers, perhaps even playing a substantial role in society. In 1852, as he waited for his group to come across the Atlantic to be installed at the Capitol, Greenaw, who was deeply worried about the nation's increasing disunion, wrote, quote, "I believe that these states need art as a visible exponent of their civilization," unquote. His phrasing is specific and significant. Through its form, Greenaw asserts that art is needed as the champion of American civilization, a loaded concept with particular racial and potential genocidal valence. Further, from poet Enrico Poerio, studying Persico's work in Naples, we understand that the public sculptor is motivated by and gives visual form to patriotic concepts. Dedicating his poem Sia Lodato to Persico, Poerio writes, quote, "Sia lode a te che intendere sappesti il gran concetto, allor che d'amore patrio ti ribolivi il petto, e che il sappesti svolgere come pensato, unquote. Crucially, though, the patriotism Poerio sees in Persico's work is for Italy, which is beginning its work of nation building, and not the older United States. Though previous scholarship regarding the art of the capital has concerned only a national context, each of the sculptors competing for this commission was a professional whose work and life can only be viewed accurately through a transnational lens. Of the many complexities that are revealed through a transnational approach to these works, perhaps the most significant is a more accurate understanding of the central allegory of the rise of civilization, though that allegory itself had been completely forgotten about the works as well. This comes with a sobering reality, which is made blatant in excited comments from Grenat to his brother Henry regarding visitors' reactions to his group when exhibited in his Florentine studio. Quote, "The studio has been overflowing with strangers of all nations, Russians, French, and English. I had as many as 4 lords at the same time last week. I assure you, the most enthusiastic feeling is expressed for the Anglo-Saxon conqueror in the group. No one has more happily told me what I meant than a distinguished French gentleman who was with me yesterday. He said, 'J'admire au plus haut degré la douce fermeté de cette nature supérieure qui tout en conquérant sans la compassion.' Words to that effect are uttered constantly. This is really a success if you consider the subtlety of the combination here supposed," unquote. Grenat is elated that a multinational white audience would recognize and praise the allegorized Anglo-Saxon conqueror rising in triumph over all other races. If art is to be a visual champion of civilization, Grenat's group, at least, has sinister goals at heart. Notice that we have now made an important shift. Though the commission was intended for the capital, the ideas of race, power, and civilization that these works championed were not limited to the concerns of the federal government. Instead, these sculptures were conceived for audiences on both sides of the Atlantic and with ideas of race and power that were understood in the 1840s, presage white dominance of the globe, not just on the US frontier. The 3 sculptors who competed for the commission, Persico, Grenat, and Ferdinand Petrich, each occupied a different identity position with respect to whiteness, and their works convey important distinctions regarding these claims. Each of these artists also was concerned with seeking out artistic content that would be a visual exponent of American civilization, but that would also resonate with precise audiences in the Italian peninsula. And I believe the powerful forces of union and disunion in both the United States and the cities of the future nation of Italy gave particular appeal to the concepts of white civilization. In 1836, when Congress opened debate on a bill to commission 2 sculptural groups for the cheek blocks of the East Front, it was no accident that all 3 of these sculptors could be found at work in studios on the Capitol grounds. We can trace some of the political and interpersonal intrigue through private correspondence and statements in the press. The National Intelligencer reported that Persico and Petrich were, quote, applicants for the groups of the East Front, unquote, while Grenat was publicly thought to have traveled from Florence to work on research for his monumental George Washington, a commission he had already secured from the federal government. Privately, though, the previous spring, Grenat had confided other motives for his trip to Henry, quote, "I have plans of great moment, which depend partly on my getting to DC when Congress is sitting," unquote. Likely, he sought the commission. As Congress closed its session without passing the bill, Persico began to model his proposed sculptural groups, and Grenat, according to the newspapers, quote, advised Petrich to do the same, unquote, a recommendation supported by President Andrew Jackson. Once completed, the models were displayed in the Capitol, commanding the attention of Congress. Though no models survive, an article in the Washington Globe promoting Persico's bid discusses his proposals. Quote, "Most of the members of both houses have seen the models, and the opinion has been unanimous that it would be impossible to surpass them, especially his magnificent figure of Columbus, in their sublimity, their beauty, their far-reaching extent of symbolical signification, and their perfect appropriateness to the position for which they are designed," unquote. The presence of these three sculptors working on the Capitol's grounds and the jockeying in the press, in the DC social scene, and even in the halls of Congress reveals the high political and artistic stakes of such a commission. As Jackson's presidency came to a close, nativist discourse was on the rise in the United States, and public arguments applied this litmus test to these sculptors. As commentators threw their support behind one or another sculptor, race and identity were crucial. For Petrish's supporters, the use of local stone and the completion of the works in Washington, D.C. was the vital American element that would counterbalance the sculptor's staunch Roman Catholic faith and his immigrant status. Born in Dresden, where he first learned to sculpt from his father Franz, Petrisch had completed his training in Rome with Berthold Thorvaldsen and lived for more than a decade there. He immigrated to the United States with his Roman wife and children. Commentators, however, staunchly referred to him as German and mocked his struggles with English. For Persico's supporters, the sculptor's choice of American citizenship gave him a special passion for democratic principles. Despite his US citizenship, even Persico's supporters referred to him as, quote, the Italian Persico, and often appended descriptors such as small, dark, or emotional, capturing the prevalent racism against darker-skinned Mediterranean peoples. Greenough, meanwhile, was consistently hailed as the native son, even though he had long ago left the United States to reside in Italy. Having first trained in sculpture in Rome with Thorvaldsen, Greenough then studied with Tuscan sculptor Lorenzo Bartolini and settled in Florence. As they jockeyed with one another in DC, these sculptors were neither friends nor strangers. They had shared personal and professional networks across two continents, which I hope to further understand using network analysis. The labels of American, German, or Italian, or immigrant have long obscured the real interrelationships across their careers and the common, if competing, aesthetic languages that they spoke. Many 19th century contributors to newspapers and art commentary used these labels strategically. That art historical scholarship continues stubbornly to apply them so firmly is concerning. Early in 1837, the bill for the sculptures passed, and the new administration of President Martin Van Buren selected Persico and Greenough to complete the works. In disgust, Petrish's supporter wrote, quote, "What a change. Greenough and Persico will now make the groups in Italy. We shall hear nothing of them till they are completed," unquote. Why exactly Van Buren chose to split the commission between Persico and Greenough is unresolved, but let's lay out the facts. Congress did not have a predetermined subject for the commission, and we have already established that the East Front prominently featured Persico's sculpture. It was expected that one sculptor would be commissioned for both monumental groups. Both Persico and Petrisch produced models, while Greenough demurred from public competition. Indeed, nothing indicates he even began planning for his group until after receiving the federal commission, when he proposed his triumph of civilization in response to Persico's discovery. Cutting through the political layers and the personal lobbying, it seems that Van Buren responded to nativist pressure by awarding half the commission to Greenough. Of the three sculptors, only Greenough was Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, and born in the United States. Meanwhile, Petrisch, a recent immigrant and a Roman Catholic, lost out despite the strongest artistic credentials. However, Petrisch was persistent, and his goal of contributing work for the US government continued, as we will see. Once the commissions were made, Persico and Greenough executed their work separately, one in Naples, Persico's hometown, the other in Florence. They met up a few times for chores like selecting the marble quarry. So far, knowledge of their process is asymmetrical. Greenough's work is documented in published correspondence, while there is no archive for Persico. Furthermore, numerous secondary sources discuss Greenough, while the total corpus of scholarship concerning Persico would fit in a pretty slim file folder. As my research has progressed, I have identified important common agreement on content between their groups, but also significant differences with respect to their individual claims. Both sculptors based their works on the concept of the rise of civilization. Both saw the origins of civilization in European ancestry, and both saw the Italian peninsula as integral to this arc. However, while Greenough crafted a vision of Anglo-Saxon triumph in America, one that to his mind could unify the nation with a binding idea of racial supremacy, besting sectional tensions, Persico seemingly embraced a wider view of whiteness, one that would also celebrate and uplift his native people, known at the time as the Italo-Greci, including them in this narrative of white civilization, and in so doing, contributing to the Risorgimento work of building a common identity on the Italian peninsula. Indeed, race is clearly less central to Persico's allegory of civilization, though its concept becomes implicated within the teleology asserted by Greenaw's group. Let's look a bit more at both works and their individual allegories of civilization. Persico's work was the first to be completed and was also, as we've discussed, the launching point for the concept. It contained two figures, one allegorical and the other historical. The nude woman is America. Though period viewers seem to have read America as indigenous, a common characteristic of America in allegorical form, the only visible racial markers are high cheekbones. Her nudity is partially concealed with a classicized drape. Looking carefully at the pose, at least to the degree it is intelligible from existing documentation, we can see that America has both knees bent and leans over. Her right hand extends parallel to the ground while her left hand points upward with palm out. She turns her head directly left toward the male figure, perhaps glancing up. While she can be described as crouching, a reading closer to Persico's own might view her as rising up, pulled from the ground by the symbolic force of Columbus's uplifted globe. Columbus is, of course, a historical figure of the Renaissance period, though here he may allegorize the dawn of modern civilization, and certainly, as we'll see, the cultural genius of Italy. Persico shows him striding powerfully forward and holding the globe above America. Persico researched Columbus's attire, traveling to Genoa and perhaps Spain, and sources describe the sculpted armor as highly detailed and beautiful. Importantly, in Naples, Persico exhibited the two figures several meters from one another. Though they are a pair, together allegorizing the dawn of civilization in the European Renaissance, the sculptor's preferred installation was not achieved at the capital. In Naples, viewers enthused over Persico's group, seeing in it a tribute to America, but also the spark of Italianità. I have found texts by 5 different authors in Naples interacting with these works in the 1840s. These include 2 poems, a Latin inscription, and 2 essays of art criticism, none of which have previously been treated in the secondary scholarship. In my 5-minute talk, I introduced a poem to the statues by Alessandro Poerio, renowned poet of the Risorgimento. Earlier in this talk, I shared a stanza from his brother Enrico's longer poem, Sia Lodato, dedicated to Persico and dated to April 5th, 1843 in Naples. And summing up Persico's concept, I'd like to turn to the latter poem for a few key lines. Poerio writes, "Sia lode a te che esprimere ti piacque con la mente in questo doppio simbolo, l'America nascente e il genio dell'Italia che a vita la chiamò." Unquote. In Naples, Persico's concept ties powerfully to the Risorgimento, while in the United States, the birth of America would also be compelling. Both audiences would welcome the visualization of the launching spark for civilization in the European Renaissance, conceptualized in Columbus's forceful pose. Greenaw's work has been known as the Rescue Group since the early 20th century, but 19th century writers called it Civilization, or the Triumph of Civilization, and the latter name seems most accurate. Existing scholarship has tied it primarily to captivity or frontier narratives, similar to what is shown here by Kauzici. Yet formal comparison supports my findings that Greenaw's focus lay elsewhere. While both works make the white male dominant, Kauzici shows Boone as a specific historical figure dressed in Western attire. Greenaw, by contrast, shows his looming figure with headgear and robes incongruous to the frontier. This Anglo-Saxon conqueror rises to supreme power from the inspiration of the Renaissance. Here, my realization that the pose and shaggy mane of Greenaw's dog makes visual reference to the Etruscan chimera comes into further focus. Unlike Persico, Greenaw's vision of civilization is dedicated to a closely focused and hegemonic idea of race. Florentine and Tuscan society, then under the Austrian Empire, could be celebrated, as could the pre-Roman peoples of Italy, like the Etruscans. But international thinking of Greenaw's contemporaries, including of his close friend and raging white power advocate, Samuel F.B. Morse, saw the Latin races, the Italian and Spanish people, as subjugated to the Anglo-Saxon race. Greenaw allegorizes a triumph of civilization that is tied to and honors the Florentine context, while celebrating the American Anglo-Saxons' victory. Greenaw renders what Morse and others in the 1840s asserted was the inevitable eradication of all non-white peoples and the subjugation of what they saw as lesser white races under the force of the triumphant American Anglo-Saxon. There is so much more to say, but now let's return to the slighted Petrish. While Persico and Greenaw formulated their works in Naples and Florence, Petrish remained in DC, where he established a studio near the White House. He worked industriously and struggled tenaciously, gaining minimal traction within the xenophobic tides of the city. He began an ambitious project taking portraits of Native American leaders who came to DC on diplomatic missions, and he modeled a distinct historical work representing the death of Tecumseh. At last, he received a modest federal commission to craft the pedestal for Greenaw's monumental George Washington, and he planned to add sculptural reliefs of his own design to the pedestal pro bono. Perhaps this ambitious scheme crossed the line for those to whom Washington's monumental body and its American Anglo-Saxon sculptor meant so much. Late one night in early June 1842, just after he entered his studio, Petrish was attacked by a pair of armed assailants. A struggle ensued. Newspapers recounted, quote, "The assassins were disguised, their faces and hands were blackened, and in the scuffle, Petrish tore off a part of the shirt bosom of one of them, which displayed a white skin beneath," unquote. Petrish was brutally stabbed with serious wounds in the abdomen, and he almost died that night. The would-be assassins were never found and charges were never brought, but President John Tyler took special personal interest in helping Petrish and facilitated the sculptor's relocation to Rio de Janeiro, where he lived until returning to Rome in 1857. Rumor and innuendo abounded in accounts of his stabbing, but a few details are integral. First, common to other accounts of violence in the young US, Petrish's assailants are acknowledged as white men, but described as wearing blackface. Second, newspaper accounts made both sculpture and race central to the attack, suggesting the motive was, quote, jealousy of an Italian rival, unquote, or more explicitly asking, quote, who then did it? Surely no American would murder an artist on account of his skill and fame. Might it not have been done by some foreign artist who had used the stiletto in Spain or Italy? It is possible, unquote. Now, despite all this, in 1869, Petrish managed to exhibit his dying Tecumseh, then carved in marble in the rotunda of the Capitol, from which it eventually relocated to the crypt and then to the Smithsonian. This rare stereoscope shows it on exhibit in the Capitol. The original version in painted plaster was acquired as part of Petrish's prized Indian gallery, collected by Pope Pius IX, and remains in the Vatican museums. Installed at the Capitol, city guides noted, quote, soldiers particularly seemed to admire this specimen of chisel, unquote. If Greenaw represented an anonymous allegory of white triumph, Petrish invited viewers to gather and celebrate the specific heroics of white soldiers using one man's violent death, conceptualize the end of non-white peoples, a gruesome visual motif that corresponds with the allegory of civilization. This work's representation of Tecumseh's death could also celebrate specific soldiers turned politicians, including President Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and Vice President Richard Johnson, all of whom recounted combating Tecumseh as he fought and died alongside the British in the War of 1812. In DC, few people probably thought of audiences in Rome who studied the second version of the work while debating the role of the temporal power of the Pope within the still forming nation of Italy. Supporters of a Christian civilization in Rome found different meanings of both race and power in this work. Pearlstein, Petrich, and Greenough worked across the boundaries of modern nation states, bonded together by a theme of triumphant white civilization. Their works varied in competing claims to whiteness and to the contours of civilization. Further, distinct political positions on both sides of the Atlantic shaped the reception of their works and likely the artist's motives. It may be a fortunate accident of history that none of these works continues to extend its message of triumphant white civilization in the capital today. Yet it strikes me that the absence of all three has also allowed society to avoid deep reckoning with the race-based allegories of civilization that they represent. The story of these statues can help to probe the origins of white supremacist ideas as they first took root in the United States in the 1840s. These works also make transparent the valuable transnational currency of these ideas about whiteness and power. And though these public statues themselves could achieve very little, the attack on Petrich reminds us that the beliefs for which they stood resulted in violence against real bodies. Quincy Adams credits artists for lighting the torch of civilization for the world. But the implicit concept of civilization was one that uplifted the white male and degraded all others. Yet disagreements about who qualifies as white lay bare the fiction of whiteness itself, as Pearlstein and Petrich strive and fail to meet that marker. And they give us a deep view into the cultural origins of the white supremacist movement of the 20th and 21st centuries. Though absent from the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, the torch of these works clearly still burns there and elsewhere. To me, this is a reminder that white supremacy will not be extinguished through the destruction of art. Historical interpretation, by contrast, permits deep exploration of the constructions of civilization and whiteness built into these works, uncovering the myths and constructions by which they are framed. These works were not monolithic, and their disagreements about race and civilization are a wedge that cracks the founding myths of whiteness and of civilization. With respect to public art, deconstruction, the theoretical approach, may prove more effective than iconoclasm.
Questions for Ellen and Julia?
Ellen, both of you. Ellen, can you talk about how your work with the feathers has spurred on your work that you're going to be doing in Rome?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's a great question. So I realized, as we all do, that there are extraordinary North American indigenous materials that were collected by missionaries that are held in significant museums here in Rome, as well as, of course, throughout Europe and the European continent. And I wanted to, I'm very interested to find out how conservators in particular are taking steps to interpret and conserve collections like this kind of featherwork, absent the direct tie to these very communities that are easy for me to reach because I reside in California and I, can reach people. But I recognize that there must be alternative systems that are being used, whether they're digital, sharing of digital images. I know with African collections that reach to diaspora community members. So I'm very interested to find out what those methodologies look like and how how that work is being. So yeah, so that's essentially what my project is here. Yeah. Thanks. Questions? Yeah.
Renee?
So sort of put within the context of, this is for you, Alex.
Okay.
But put within the context of Julia's presentation
Yeah.
of white hegemony. How do you find your work is situated within conversations of appropriation of indigenous culture, specifically hairdressers? And then tangent to that, to Julia, you attended a university where that was a massive issue with Mascot, also centered around Native American headdress and the hegemonic systems that facilitated the removal of that at the behest of many people who are not happy about that happening. I'm kind of just interested in both sort of the way you both see this sort of issue.
Well, you know, I can say that, I mean, I think there's, obviously appropriation is, you know, a huge issue within Native America. And I mean, we have court cases where the state flag for New Mexico is absolutely lifted from the Zia Pueblo in New Mexico, and the Zia are still fighting to have their right to that motif, particular motif, be acknowledged, compensated, etc. I work in a way. I mean, a few of the people that I've introduced to you are co-authors in my work, and I think that I'm very personally aware about my work being appropriative, and working very hard to maintain long-standing relationships. I mean, I'm now working with people over 10 years, and also the work that I'm doing can't just be rewarding to me. It has to be, I can work as a conservator in service of to answer questions that community members have. And that's what, so they now know that I'm a resource in their own inquiries. So I don't know if I took this slightly askew, from what you were asking, but yeah, that would be my response.
So were you asking specifically about the Mascot controversy at University of Illinois?
Sure. I'm just trying to show that there was a sort of underlying connection between the two of your talks, but that was intentional or not. And then especially when the first couple slides you showed on January 6th were people who were adopting sort of Native American headdress or ideologies as assholes. So.
Yeah. So I actually was in graduate school at the time when the university was subject to protests. One of my graduate instructors was Fred Hoxie, who's a historian of Native American history, and he was very involved in that advocacy work. So I happened just by chance to be in a graduate seminar with him the semester they removed Chief Iconography from the university. So perhaps that framed a bit of my thinking. But in thinking about your question, what struck me more was the display in the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. They have a kind of a permanent room of appropriations where they have brands and t-shirts and signage from all across the country that just uses different names, different tribal groups. And I've taken a number of undergraduate classes there. And it's really eye-opening to students at that point in their lives, because they've never really thought about how natural something like a Jeep Cherokee is to them and how horrible it is in terms of its larger cultural valence. So I think, I don't, think the QAnon shaman would have ever read Playing Indian, but I wish someone would make him, you know.
Any questions? Lily?
I had a question for Ellen. I was really fascinated with the kinds of conversations that you showed us that you have with Indigenous communities. And it was really illuminating the kinds of information that you acquire about the customs and the workmanship behind it. And that made me wonder whether you studied the historical development of these customs or just whether they change at all. That thinking about these living sources made me wonder whether these customs change, like either the ceremonies themselves or the workmanship practices. So I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. They absolutely have changed. They do change. You know, the regalia makers have had to, by force of habitat, you know, incorporate different words. You know, and, you know, like, for example, the hoopah, or I should know, sorry, the pomo, for example, you know, a lot of these indigenous groups suffered like extraordinary extinction and loss at a certain point, and they started revamping or rethinking their own ceremonies to be like renewal ceremonies. So, you know, there's a absolute response to what is available, you know, what is happening, and yeah, so they absolutely do change over time and have changed over time. And I was particularly interested in watching that happen with like I didn't mention this woman, Linda Amane, who is Alone. She's from, again, Northern California. And she receives commissions for her extraordinary baskets, which I didn't show, but she can't use what would have been the traditional feather in her feathered baskets. She's incorporating a whole new tradition of working. Yeah, so both the ceremonies, the traditions, and the materials have definitely changed.
I have a question for you, Julia. So Persico and Petrich, they're both immigrants, and you refer to that kind of way in which they're buying into this white supremacist discourse and this civilizing discourse. But it's the 1840s. So I'm wondering about their politics. Are they Republicans? Are they anti-monarchists? Do they participate in any of the revolutions of 1848? And does that problematize, what do we do with that? If they were, then they're on the left of the spectrum and they're producing this kind of art.
This is one of the sort of questions I'm trying to answer as I continue working on the book, because the artists are engaging closely with actual politicians, right? And they're having friendships or animosities with individuals, like in the Petrich family papers, they named John Quincy Adams as possibly responsible for the stabbing. So there are really potent political dynamics, but they're also transnational. So Persico, for example, there's some evidence he might have actually fought during Italian unification. On the other hand, he also made a portrait of one of the Bourbon kings for Palermo. Those seem contradictory, but it's a complicated moment in time. At another point, I have a record of him denying he's a citizen of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. He's an American citizen, he's not Italian, but then he does repatriate to Naples and doesn't go back to the United States after around 1848 or so. So it's not a straightforward question to answer. Yeah. But very interesting. So the most important thing politically with regard to him that I've really been thinking about is his close allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church. And once he returns to Rome, he very clearly is aligned with the Pope. That collection is a very prominent gift to the Vatican. And so, for example, I don't think he would have supported the Italian unification. Also, with respect to him, he has a few very strong ties to the American South, which are interesting, and a couple of major commissions during those years right around the Civil War that are really interesting. And that sort of point also applies to Greenough, who, although from Massachusetts, is so racist that he actually states he will side with the South if a war breaks out that's about equal freedom society for the enslaved African Americans.
Two quick questions. Julia, I think you mentioned in your 5-minute talk, but if we want to view these, I'm curious to know what their current context is and how we might see them. And then Ellen, one of the questions that you brought up for me is what kind of conservation work is being done to these works that have faded, whether you try to get the original bird feather type, whether you recolor them, or what the conservation action to be done, especially since you told us that the Native community was telling you that this was inappropriate. So
mine's a very quick answer. You can't see them. They were removed in the 1950s, and greenhouse was actually dropped by a crane in the 1970s. They've been left in outdoor storage. They're basically just like melted marble in a storage facility. Nobody is ever allowed to see them. I've seen photos, and I've seen the dog, which I mentioned this in my 5-minute talk. That's really what made me discover the importance of the Renaissance, the importance of Florence to greenhouse work, because of this fascinating similarity to the Chimera that none of the existing photos show you. So part of this larger project for me in thinking about destruction is exactly that. The nature of the racism was much less intelligible without the actual pieces. It took me a lot longer to get to it.
So in terms of the nature of the conservation work that's done, it's very interesting because in the case of Indigenous collection material, first of all, in the instances of color loss like that fading, there is no step that can be taken aside from literally applying another material to the featherwork that would be mimicking that color. And because of that, in the case of Indigenous collection material, we would simply not do that because it's kind of too interventive, it's too aggressive. It might be the case that, first of all, in collections where there are multiple examples, the one would be chosen that has the most vibrant coloration still preserved. In another case, it might be a didactic accompanying the piece to sort of help explain it. But interestingly, I have to say that right now I'm part of a project at the American Museum of Natural History, which is looking at bird taxidermy mounts that are in their collections that are also have great age. And they are looking at recoloring. We are looking at recoloring those because the birds can be either extinct or extremely rare. I didn't even bring up the whole legal issue actually that birds are protected. They're legally controlled. Most of the birds that are important to communities are completely controlled now by the US government. So they can't even legally hold some of these birds that they use in their regalia. But in the same is the case for the bird specimens in the Natural History Museum, where they can't replace it with another example. And their recoloring is actually something that's being systematically explored as a treatment approach, but that it won't extend over to Indigenous featherwork. It's a very different sensibility.
you just mention if the birds can remain alive with the use of their feathers, or is this inherently killing the bird?
No, the birds can stay alive. You can pluck feathers from a live bird as long as you don't pluck, so many feathers that you're impeding the bird's flight, the bird signaling to a potential partner, as long as you leave the bird kind of viable. And I've also kind of done research on feather collecting practices. So there are communities that make these traps that trap the bird, especially the woodpeckers, because the woodpeckers are inside cavities in trees. So if you put a trap over that cavity where the bird's going to come out, you've got the bird, And so feathers can be taken, and the bird can still be viable. Yeah.
Question that what is the commercial where does your work note that the institute collection, and who has access to it, or like in terms of like ownership when it comes to the community that we work with, that is providing the material that becomes part of this connection, and what is the purpose of it? What is the purpose in the space of like, does it exist in just purely as history? Does it exist like for social impact? We're changing like the views that Americans have to Native Americans, or that's more its purpose, the broader conversation, especially around like when you think of power dynamics when it comes to the network of Indigenous communities.
Yes.
Okay.
Could you
I
hear?
was
I know it
having
was
a little bit of a
hard
hard
to
time
hear.
hearing, but you were asking what is the purpose of the current existing collections of these works that I showed,
Yes.
and why,
Where does it live?
where does it live? So
About access.
yeah, about access. So I showed you materials from probably about, 10 different museums across the United States. Most of these collections were made under horrific circumstances. I mean, really, I worked in one of the museums, and I know exactly what the records say about how things were acquired. I know exactly because I functioned as an agent for repatriation in my museum because I could, and got things returned because I could. But a lot of these items are contested. Some, I can't say a lot, some are contested. There are communities, for example, if you go to the Phoebe Hearst Museum in Berkeley, at the University of California at Berkeley, and you ask to see anything that is Yurok, the community has to make the decision about whether or not you, me, anybody is allowed to look at these holdings that are held by Berkeley, that are held by. And I also had to seek permission in each of these museums. I would say what I was interested in, looking at, and they would reach out to the community and find out whether or not it would be at all appropriate for me to. I did not show you some things that I would not show you actually, because of the circumstances, under which they were shared with me. So yeah, it's a really good question. And their purpose in these collections, I think there still there are exhibits that are, it's so interesting. The Metropolitan Museum just did a show together with the De Young Museum, which is in San Francisco, the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, of the work of a French painter who came to California and painted the pomo, the LM pomo. But the Met and San Francisco could never have done that exhibit today without collaborating with members of that community. They just could never have done it. And that's kind of why I'm so interested in how are people in European institutions managing to represent this work, you know, and yeah. So.
Do we have a final question before we take the conversation upstairs with Daniel?
Just a very quick one for Julia about iconography. It's the sort of hat or helmet of civilization. I'm curious if you can say something more about it, and then still about iconography. The Christopher Columbus iconography as a warrior, as a conquistador in this case, is a very belligerent one, but it's very different from the maybe more typical representation of him as an explorer. I'm wondering whether in these years, this is the prevalent iconography of Christopher Columbus, even in other contexts.
Can I add my iconography question? Is her hair sort of signaling uncivilized, given how women wore their hair at that time, or how hair is depicted?
We can certainly compare the two women, and
Yeah.
this woman who is supposed to be with the Anglo-Saxon man, her hair is pulled back and curly. There is a difference there. This is one of the things we lose without having good photographic evidence of that figure of America. Maybe there are armbands, maybe there are other signifiers, but it's certainly playing with this allegorical concept. So the art criticism written in Naples does talk specifically in great depth about the figures, but with her focusing on savagery and the sorts of typical things you would expect with the idea of America. Your question about Columbus and the armor is interesting, and it's one that I'm hoping to explore from the European point of view while I'm over here. In the United States, there are some other contemporary representations of Columbus right around this time in the Capitol that are paintings. But Persico has this whole other perspective because he's over here in Europe when he's working it up. And I know he traveled to look at armor, but I don't know exactly what he was looking at. So, anyone who has suggestions, send them my way. Yeah. And with respect to the Anglo-Saxons helmet, I have not found a perfect match yet. I found things that make me think Renaissance man, but not exactly the one thing that I feel he's looking at as inspiration. But it is one of those tips to us that this isn't a Daniel Boone, because it's not right for those frontier representations.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
I also have